From the 15th century onward, the flags of European powers were planted across the globe, not to bring peace or partnership, but to claim, conquer, and consume. Under the polished language of civilizing missions and spreading Christianity, they brought something far more sinister: violence, slavery, exploitation, starvation, and death. Empires were built, not on dreams, but on stolen land, broken bodies, and erased cultures. They said they came to build, but they burned. They said they came to teach, but they silenced. They said they came to save, but they slaughtered. For those in Europe, the colonial age brought gold, spices, rubber, land, and global influence. For those who were colonized, it brought whips, chains, starvation, and guns. Today, many speak of history with pride, but for millions, colonialism was not a chapter in a textbook. It was a generational wound, bleeding through time. Even now, the shadows of empire remain. Entire nations still struggling with poverty, born from looted wealth, indigenous languages and traditions hanging by a thread, trauma passed from grandparents to grandchildren, unspoken but ever present. The true cost of empire wasn't measured in gold bars or territories gained. It was measured in hands cut off in the Congo, children dying of hunger in Bengal, whole tribes wiped out in Namibia, massacres in India, Algeria, Haiti, and beyond. This is not just a list of dates and places. This is a reckoning. Welcome to the brutal truth of European colonialism. Each empire, each flag, each so-called civilizing force left behind a trail of broken nations and shattered lives. And now, it's time to remember what they did. Not to shame, not to forget, but to finally tell the truth, the way the colonized lived it, not the way the colonizers wrote it. History must not only be studied, it must be felt. To the world, he was a king. To millions in Africa, he was a butcher with a crown. In the late 19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium stood before the world and made a grand promise that he would civilize the heart of Africa, that he would bring light, progress, and faith to the so-called dark continent. But behind closed doors, Leopold's Congo Free State was anything but free. It was a private empire, owned by him alone, where human life was traded for rubber, ivory, and profit. The illusion of civilization. King Leopold didn't just claim land, he claimed lives. He told the world he was bringing civilization. What he brought instead was a brutal system of forced labor, built on greed and maintained through terror. Rubber was in high demand due to industrial progress in Europe, used for tires, machines, and wealth. To meet this demand, African men were forced into the jungle to harvest rubber vines. But there was a price for failure. If a man failed to collect enough rubber, the punishment was swift and horrifying. Soldiers of the king's private army, known as the Force Publique, would take hostages, wives, children, even entire families, until the quotas were met. If they still came up short, they were beaten, whipped, or mutilated. The hands that paid the price. One of the most horrifying symbols of this era was the severed hand. Each soldier was ordered, do not waste a bullet. If a shot was fired, proof was required, so they were told to bring back one human hand for every bullet used. Sometimes they cut off the hands of corpses, other times they cut them off while the victims were still alive. Some soldiers, desperate to meet their quotas, bought hands, traded for hands, or chopped them off from random villages just to avoid punishment. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Mothers were raped while their husbands bled in the fields. Children were orphaned in the name of progress. If your husband fails to collect enough rubber, one soldier told a woman, your baby's hand will pay for it. This wasn't colonization. This was systematic terror, disguised as empire. Voices of witness. In 1890, an African-American missionary named George Washington Williams traveled to the Congo. What he saw shocked him so deeply, he wrote an open letter to King Leopold himself. He described prisoners shackled in iron chains, so tight that their flesh rotted and flies hovered around their infected wounds. He wrote of people whipped with the shikot, a brutal whip made from dried hippopotamus hide that tore through skin and muscle with every strike. He saw men beaten to the brink of death. He saw women starving. He saw a country bleeding under the shadow of a foreign crown. And yet, Leopold remained silent. He ignored the cries, the deaths, the shame. A kingdom of corpses. Historians estimate that up to 10 million Africans died during Leopold's reign. That's not a statistic. That's entire families, lineages, cultures, wiped from history. While Europe applauded the wealth flowing in from Congo, African villages turned to ashes. While newspapers celebrated Leopold as a great king, African children disappeared into unmarked graves. Eventually, the global outcry grew too loud to ignore. In 1908, the Belgian government took control from Leopold and renamed it the Belgian Congo. But for millions, it was too late. The damage was done. The scars were permanent. He ruled like a god, but left as a ghost, haunted by the screams of a nation he tried to erase. They didn't kill with bullets. They killed with silence, with grain ships sailing past starving children. India, once a land of empires and rich harvests, was reshaped under the shadow of the British crown. It became the jewel of the British Empire, but only for those who wore the jewels. For the people of India, colonization meant more than stolen sovereignty. It meant famine after famine. It meant starvation in the presence of abundance. It meant dying with grain sacks locked behind British doors. The famines Britain let happen. Famine is a force of nature, but under British rule, it became a weapon of policy. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, India suffered wave after wave of famine, millions dying. While food was exported to fuel the empire, crops failed, monsoons vanished. But what deepened the wound was Britain's deliberate inaction. 1866, the Orissa famine. When crops failed in the region of Orissa, modern-day Odisha, the British authorities ignored the early warnings. Supplies were withheld, action delayed. It wasn't until British soldiers themselves began starving that help was even considered. By then, 1/3 of Orissa's population was gone, dead from hunger, disease, and neglect. 1876, 1878, the Madras famine. Across southern India, from Madras to the Deccan Plateau, famine swept through villages like wildfire. As 5 million Indians died, British administrators continued exporting rice and wheat to England and its colonies. Even as fields turned to dust and mothers wailed beside lifeless children, the empire fed itself, not the land it ruled. 1943, the Bengal famine. Then came the most horrifying of all. World War II raged on, and British interests came first, even over Indian lives. Churchill's government exported over 70,000 tons of rice between January and July of 1943, enough to feed millions. But Bengal received nothing. What followed was one of the worst man-made disasters in modern history. Children were abandoned in rivers and wells because parents could no longer feed them. Desperate families ate grass, leaves, and tree bark. Train tracks became sites of mass suicide, where starving men and women flung themselves before locomotives. Mothers watched their babies wither, while British warehouses sat full. People begged for the water that had boiled rice, a survivor later recalled. By the time it ended, over 3 million people had died in Bengal. A cold empire. Historians still debate the exact cause of these famines. But one thing is clear, British policies didn't just fail to help, they made things worse. While Indian fields were barren, grain was shipped out. While Indian children starved, price controls were lifted, making food too expensive to buy. And while Indian voices cried out for aid, they were answered only with indifference. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister of Britain, famously said of Indians, "They breed like rabbits." The cost of apathy. From 1765 to 1947, it's estimated that over 30 million Indians died in famines under British rule, not from natural disaster, but from policies that saw brown lives as expendable, from a system designed not to serve the land, but to drain it dry. The British didn't burn India's villages, they just watched them die, and that silence was louder than any cannon. They didn't come as gods, they came as gold-thirsty ghosts, with fire in their hands and death in their wake. Spain's conquest of the Americas is often told as a tale of heroism, of explorers, adventurers, and empire builders. But beneath the romantic myths lies a reality soaked in blood, betrayal, and broken empires. The Spanish didn't discover the New World, they invaded it, desecrated it, and buried it beneath their churches and cities. The fall of the Aztecs, betrayed by belief. In 1519, Hernán Cortés stepped onto the shores of what is now Mexico. He didn't come alone, he brought horses, steel, gunpowder, and a lust for gold that would consume a civilization. The Aztecs, a mighty empire centered in Tenochtitlan, had never seen such strangers. Their emperor, Montezuma II, sent gifts, gold, feathers, and sacred tokens, hoping these strange men would leave. But Cortés had no intention of leaving. He burned his own ships, forcing his men to march inland. Along the way, he forged alliances with tribes who hated the Aztecs, turning brother against brother. Then came the massacre at Colonial, a city that had offered no resistance. Cortés ordered his men to attack during a peaceful gathering. Within hours, over 3,000 people lay dead, their blood soaking the temple floors. When Cortés finally reached Tenochtitlan, he was greeted not with war, but with hospitality and gifts. Montezuma, perhaps thinking Cortés was the prophesied god Cortol, welcomed him as an honored guest. And that's when Cortés struck. He seized Montezuma, forced him to submit to the Spanish king, and humiliated him before his own people. Tensions rose, riots erupted, the city burned, and in the chaos, Montezuma was killed by the very people he once ruled. What followed was war, a war that starved the city, a war that brought smallpox, wiping out thousands in days, a war that ended with Tenochtitlan in ruins, its temples smashed, its libraries destroyed, its gods silenced. The women cried, the children screamed, the warriors stood frozen, staring at the ash that was once their world. By 1521, the mighty Aztec Empire had fallen. In its place, the Spanish built New Spain, on top of bones, memories, and shattered stone. The fall of the Incas, gold for blood. A few years later, the Spanish marched south, this time toward the Andes, toward the empire of the Inca. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived in what is now Peru. The Inca were reeling from civil war between brothers Atahualpa and Huasca. Though Atahualpa had won, the land was still fragile, fractured. And then came the strangers. Pizarro requested a peaceful meeting with Atahualpa. The emperor agreed, unarmed and trusting. What happened next was an ambush. Pizarro's men killed over 5,000 Inca warriors in one day, without losing a single Spaniard. They took Atahualpa hostage and demanded a ransom in gold and silver. The Inca filled entire rooms with treasures, but even after the ransom was paid, the Spanish executed Atahualpa, burned at the stake, strangled, erased. With their emperor dead, the Inca splintered, and over the next 4 decades, the Spanish hunted down the last Inca strongholds, one by one, until nothing remained but ruins. The legacy of conquest. The Spanish didn't just take gold, they took identity. They burned native scrolls, destroying centuries of knowledge. They banned native languages. They converted temples into cathedrals and renamed gods as devil. They enslaved entire communities in silver mines and plantations. Disease followed conquest. Smallpox, measles, influenza, plagues that had no cure in the New World, killed up to 90% of indigenous populations. Out of an estimated 25 million indigenous people, only 1 million survived by the late 1600s, not from war alone, but from the slow choking grip of empire. They came in search of riches. They left behind silence. Some empires conquer with armies, others with railroads, but the British built their legacy in Africa with fences, disease, and despair. At the southern tip of Africa, two powers clashed, not natives and colonizers this time, but colonizers versus colonizers. The Boners, descendants of Dutch and African settlers, had carved out their own republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Farmers, fiercely independent and deeply rooted in the land. But the British Empire, hungry for complete control of South Africa and the gold and diamonds beneath its soil, had other plans. And so, in 1899, war erupted. The South African Second Boners War begins. The Boners, although fewer in number, knew the land. They fought fiercely, launching guerrilla attacks, ambushing British supply lines, and refusing to surrender. The British, stunned by their resistance, turned to something darker, a strategy not to defeat armies, but to break spirits. They began burning farms, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, and then they rounded up Boners' families, women, children, the elderly, and sent them into hastily built concentration camps. The camps of cruelty. By 1901, over 100,000 Boners civilians were living behind barbed wire in British-run camps. The British called them refugee camps, but they were prisons. No clean water, no medical care, no proper shelter. One visitor described the camps as miles away from town, dumped down on bare brown valleys, without a tree or shade in sight. Diseases like measles, typhoid, and dysentery spread like wildfire. There were not enough doctors, not enough food, not enough humanity. Boners' mothers watched helplessly as their babies wasted away. Some days, as many as 500 people died. By the war's end, 26,000 Boners women and children were dead, over 10% of the Boners population. Forgotten even deeper, the black camps largely erased from most retellings. Other separate camps created for black South Africans, many of whom had been forcibly removed, accused of aiding the Boners, or simply caught in the crossfire. These camps were even worse. No rations, no medicine, no record keeping. Up to 20,000 black civilians died in these camps, quietly, invisibly, without even names on grave markers. They weren't rebels, they weren't soldiers, they were just in the way. The aftermath of empire. When the war ended in 1902, Britain annexed the Boners republics into its empire. The world moved on. The crown celebrated victory, but the land remembered the cries. The children who died in those camps. They never picked up a rifle, they never chose a side, but they paid the price of imperial ambition. And yet, these stories of fences built not for protection, but for extermination, rarely appear in history books, because the victors didn't just write the history, they buried the victims in footnotes. They called it a war, but in the camps, it wasn't bullets that killed, it was cold, and silence, and indifference. You can steal a people's land, you can burn their homes, you can silence their leaders, but you cannot kill the cry for freedom. Kenya, in the heart of East Africa, had long been a crown jewel of the British Empire, not for its beauty, but for its fertile lands. And those lands, once tilled and cherished by native hands, were slowly stolen, taken by British settlers, fenced off, renamed, as if the people who lived there for generations had never existed. But the land remembers, and so did its people. The roots of rebellion. By the 1950s, the Kikuyu tribe, Kenya's largest ethnic group, had been pushed to the edge, both literally and spiritually. Their ancestral lands had been seized, their right to farm stripped away, their elders silenced, their children indoctrinated, and so, in whispers, in forests, and in coded oaths, they began to rise. A secret movement emerged from the soil itself, the Mau. It was not just a rebellion, it was a reckoning. Land and freedom, they vowed, or death, a war in the shadows. The British called it a terrorist movement, but to the Kikuyu, the Mau were freedom fighters. From 1952 onward, the Mau launched attacks on colonial farms, government offices, and British loyalists. The rebellion was raw,
scattered, and at times brutal, but it came from pain. Decades of humiliation, forced labor, displacement. Generations growing up as strangers in their own homeland. Britain's response: camps, chains, and cruelty. Unable to control the rebellion through force alone, the British declared a state of emergency. But what followed was not order, it was organized torture. Entire Kikuyu villages were rounded up. Tens of thousands were detained in camps behind barbed wire. Some were Mau fighters. Many were innocent. British officers used beatings with clubs and whips, sexual assault with bottles and bayonets, water torture, starvation, and mock executions. A survivor later testified, "They made us strip naked. They beat us until our skin opened. Then they poured pepper and salt into the wounds." In these rehabilitation camps, prisoners were told to renounce the Mau oath or die. Some did, some lied, some never spoke again. The toll of resistance: official British reports claimed only 11,000 Mau were killed, but independent studies tell another story. The Kenya Human Rights Commission estimates over 90,000 Kenyans were executed, tortured, or maimed. More than 160,000 were detained in horrific conditions. Entire villages were burned, families shattered, never reunited. And in all those years, only 32 white settlers were killed. Yet it was the Kenyans who were called savages. A nation rises among the detainees was a young nationalist, Jomo Kenyatta, labeled a Mau leader. He would one day become Kenya's first president, because no matter how many were jailed, beaten, or buried, freedom could not be strangled forever. In 1963, Kenya broke free from British rule, but the scars of the emergency remain in the eyes of survivors, in the silence of mass graves, in the haunted memories passed down through generations. They fought in forests, not for revenge, but for remembrance, for a future where no child would be born into chains. Colonizers called it a territory, the people called it home, and when the chains grew too tight, they chose fire over silence. For over a century, France ruled Algeria, not as a distant colony, but as if it were part of mainland France itself. But beneath the French flags and boulevards, Algeria was burning. The land belonged to the settlers. The laws served the occupiers and the native people. Muslims, Arabs, Berbers became strangers in their own birthplace. By the mid-23rd century, the pressure exploded. What followed was one of the bloodiest wars of decolonization in history. A land-divided France first invaded Algeria in 1830. By the 20th century, over 1 million European settlers, known as Pieds-Noirs, had taken over the most fertile lands. Algerians were denied basic rights, pushed into poverty, forbidden from political participation, punished for speaking their own language or practicing their own culture. For decades, Algerians protested peacefully. They wrote, they marched, they begged. But on May 8, 1945, everything changed.
The Sétif and Douelma massacres. As Europe celebrated the end of World War II, Algerians held a demonstration, marching for independence and dignity. They carried banners, they sang songs of freedom, and then French troops opened fire. What began as one day of violence turned into a systematic massacre. Villages were shelled, civilians, men, women, children, were rounded up and executed. Mass graves swallowed thousands. Estimates vary, but between 6,000 to 45,000 Algerians were killed in a matter of days. The message was clear: you do not belong, you do not rise. The war for independence begins, but France had gone too far. In 1954, Algerians launched an armed revolution. The National Liberation Front, FLN, was formed. Their slogan, by the ballot, or by the bullet. What followed was 8 years of horror. The French unleashed their military might, bombing villages, burning entire towns, arresting over 1 million people, torturing civilians, for information torture, as policy. This wasn't random cruelty. torture became standard procedure. A former French general, Paul Osraces, later admitted, "Only rarely were the prisoners we questioned during the night still alive the next morning, whether they talked or not. Prisoners were electrocuted, waterboarded, raped, burned, executed, without trial. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off, their residents subjected to house raids, mass arrests, and disappearances. We were told Algeria was France," one Algerian woman said, "but they treated us like dogs." The human cost. By 1962, when Algeria finally gained independence, over 1 million Algerians were dead, hundreds of thousands were displaced, whole families vanished, never seen again. The French public was divided. Many did not even know the full extent of the atrocities until decades later, and those who returned from the war, both Algerian and French, carried with them trauma too deep for words. A free Algeria, a wounded memory. On July 5, 1962, Algeria became free. But the land still remembers the screams in basements, the fires in the mountains, the graves without names. France has since acknowledged the war, but true justice never came. No reparations, no trials, just silence. They said Algeria was part of France, but when Algeria cried for freedom, they answered with flame. They chained them, whipped them, worked them to death. But one night, in the dark of the sugarcane fields, the slaves whispered a single word: freedom. On the island of Hispaniola, in the lush French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, stood some of the most profitable plantations in the world. Sugar, coffee, indigo, luxury goods that flowed into France and made its aristocracy rich beyond imagination. But the true cost: blood, sweat, chains. By the late 1700s, 500,000 African slaves were toiling under unbearable conditions, branded, beaten, and broken. Saint-Domingue was not a colony, it was a graveyard in disguise, life beneath the whip. The French colonial system in Haiti was one of the most inhumane on earth. Slaves were worked to death. By the age of 30, their backs were scarred with whips, their necks chained, women were raped and bred like livestock, runaways were hunted down, tortured, and executed in public squares. For every ton of sugar France exported, a slave died. And yet, even in that suffering, hope burned quietly. The spark of rebellion. In 1791, inspired by the French Revolution, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue decided, if the French could demand liberty and equality, so could they. Under the cover of night, the plantations began to burn. Masters were overthrown, chains were shattered, hundreds of thousands of slaves rose in a coordinated revolt. It was the largest and most successful slave uprising in world history, and at its center stood a man who would become legend: Toussaint Louverture. The general of the people, Toussaint Louverture, was a former slave, a self-taught strategist, and a brilliant leader. He organized an army of rebels, former slaves with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. He outwitted French generals, negotiated with the British and Spanish, and took control of much of the island. But Louverture didn't just fight for revenge, he fought for justice. In 1794, under immense pressure, France abolished slavery in its colonies. But peace wouldn't last. France returns with chains. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte, hungry to restore France's colonial glory, sent an army of 40,000 troops to crush the rebellion and re-enslave the population. What followed was a war of extermination. The French massacred civilians, poisoned water supplies, used death ships, where black prisoners were packed into the hulls, and suffocated with sulfur smoke, drowned men, women, and children in the ocean. In one infamous massacre, 500 black prisoners were bound, chained, and thrown alive into the sea. The ocean was red, a survivor would later say, and the fish feasted for days. The death of a leader, the birth of a nation. In 1802, Louverture was captured by deception and sent to a freezing prison cell in France. He died there in 1803, never knowing the revolution he started would succeed. But his spirit lived on. Under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the revolutionaries delivered France its first colonial defeat, and on January 1, 1804, Haiti declared itself a free and independent nation, the first black republic in the world, built entirely by former slaves, a legacy of fire and freedom. The cost was unimaginable. Over 200,000 people died, mostly slaves. Cities were destroyed, economies collapsed, but Haiti stood free, fierce, unbowed. France would never forget the humiliation, nor would it forgive. Haiti would be economically punished, diplomatically isolated, and politically demonized for centuries, all because it refused to kneel. They tried to drown them in blood, but Haiti rose from the sea, free, defiant, and drenched in the memory of the enslaved. Before Auschwitz, before Rwanda, there was Namibia, where Germany rehearsed the horror of genocide in silence and in sand. In the early 1900s, far from the streets of Berlin, in the vast deserts of southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, the German Empire began an atrocity so brutal, so cold, that historians today call it the first genocide of the 20th century. But for decades, the world forgot. A colony, built on theft, Germany, had come late to the race for empire. After the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, it claimed lands in East and West Africa. In German Southwest Africa, settlers arrived with one goal: take land, take cattle, take control. The native peoples, the Herero and the Nama, stood in the way. They resisted politely at first, then politically, then with arms, and Germany, hungry for dominance, answered with extermination. The uprising and the order to kill. In 1904, after years of abuse, land theft, and forced labor, the Herero people rose up, killing German soldiers in retaliation. Berlin responded by sending General Lothar von Trotha, a man with no interest in diplomacy. He issued an order now infamous in its cruelty: every Herero, with or without a rifle, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will not accept women or children, drive them back or kill them. The goal was not victory. The goal was elimination. Into the desert, trapped between advancing German troops and the merciless Kalahari Desert, tens of thousands of Herero people fled east. The Germans poisoned water holes, blocked access to wells, and left the Herero to die of thirst and starvation. Entire families perished under the sun. Their bones still lie beneath the sand today. Those who were captured were not spared. Camps of death survivors, men, women, even children, were sent to concentration camps along the coast. They were used as slave labor to build railroads, docks, and German outposts. Conditions were nightmarish: starvation-level rations, beatings, and rape, medical experiments on living prisoners, disease and dehydration, mass graves, dug daily. At Shark Island, the most notorious camp, prisoners were forced to sleep on bare rocks in freezing winds, chained together like animals, experimented on by doctors who would later influence Nazi ideologies. They turned the coast into a cemetery, and the sand into a secret. The human toll. By the time it ended, over 80% of the Herero population was gone. Around 65,000 people, nearly 50% of the Nama people were exterminated, at least 10,000 dead. What was once a thriving culture, with deep traditions and rich oral history, was reduced to silence. Germany denied it for over a century. The world barely spoke of it, a late reckoning. It wasn't until the 21st century that Germany finally acknowledged the truth. In 2021, over 100 years after the genocide, Germany formally recognized the massacre as genocide and offered a symbolic apology and financial aid. But for the descendants of the Herero and Nama, no words, no money, no headline could ever replace the ancestors buried in unmarked graves, the songs never sung again, the languages lost in screams. Before there was Hitler, there was von Trotha. Before gas chambers,
there was the desert, and before the world listened, it turned away. They came for spices, they stayed for centuries, and when the Indonesians asked for freedom, they were answered with bullets, fire, and silence. Indonesia, a vast beautiful archipelago of more than 17,000 islands, was once home to ancient kingdoms, rich trade networks, and cultures as deep as the seas that surrounded them. But in the 1600s, the Dutch arrived, first as traders, then as rulers, and for over 300 years, they held the islands in a colonial grip that suffocated lives, plundered resources, and erased identities. It was called the Dutch East Indies, but for the people who lived there, it was a prison made of plantations and pain. The Dutch arrival and exploitation in the 17th century. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, set up shop in what is now Jakarta. They came for cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, spices that Europe craved, and Indonesia possessed in abundance. But they didn't trade fairly, they conquered, and when the VOC collapsed in the 1800s, the Dutch government took full control, turning entire islands into cash machines for Europe. Locals were forced into labor to harvest crops, villages taxed into poverty, education and development denied. It wasn't a partnership, it was a plantation on a national scale. The fire of resistance. As the centuries passed, a hunger for freedom grew. In the early 1900s, Indonesian intellectuals and revolutionaries began calling for independence. But the Dutch dismissed them, mocked them as uncivilized, not ready for self-rule. Then came World War II. Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies, pushing out the Dutch and ruling with its own iron hand. But when the war ended in 1945, the impossible happened. Indonesia declared independence. Led by Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, a new flag was raised, a new anthem sung. The people rejoiced, but the Dutch refused to let go. Colonial comeback, with blood. The Netherlands returned, backed by Allied powers, to reclaim its colony, by force. From 1945 to 1949, Indonesia was engulfed in a war for survival. The Dutch called it police action, but what happened was a campaign of terror. They bombed villages, executed suspected rebels, arrested thousands, and in the island of Sulawesi, one of the most horrifying chapters was written. Westerling's massacres. Captain Raymond Westerling, a Dutch military commander, led brutal crackdowns in Sulawesi. From 1946 to 1947, his method was simple. Arrive before dawn, surround a village, separate the men from women and children, execute suspected rebels on the spot. There were no trials, no mercy. Anyone with a weapon, or accused of having one, was shot. Homes were burned, families shattered. Survivors called it a night of red rain. Historians now call it a war crime. In just a few months, Westerling's men killed an estimated 40,000 Indonesians. The silent torturers, other Dutch soldiers, tortured prisoners with methods that echo the darkest moments of colonial cruelty. Beatings and electrocution, starvation and public humiliation, rape and mutilation. One soldier later confessed, "I wasn't ordered to torture them. I just got used to it." You lose your soul slowly, and then you forget you had won. Victory, but not justice. In 1949, after global pressure and endless bloodshed, the Netherlands finally recognized Indonesia's independence. But the wounds never healed, the dead were never properly buried, the crimes never prosecuted, the survivors never fully heard. Even today, the Dutch government acknowledges what happened, but stops short of calling it genocide. And the descendants of those who died, they carry the memory in silence. Indonesia was born not with parades, but with the sound of gunfire, the smell of burning villages, and the promise, never again would they bow. They came with ships, flags and rifles. They called it settlement. But for the Aboriginal people of Australia, it was the slow erasure of a world they had known for 60,000 years. When British ships arrived on the shores of New South Wales in 1788, they declared the land terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning nobody's land. But the land was not empty. It was alive. It was sacred. It was home to over 500 Aboriginal nations, each with their own language, law, and spiritual connection to the earth. To the British, it was a new world. To the Aboriginal people, it was the beginning of the end. Colonization and dispossession. At first, contact was cautious. There were exchanges, peaceful gestures, and brief cooperation. But soon the settlers wanted more. More land, more livestock, more control. They pushed inland, built fences, drove herds through Aboriginal hunting grounds, and when indigenous Australians resisted, they were punished, branded as savages. Entire clans were targeted, massacres in the name of empire. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, massacre after massacre swept across the continent. 1838, Myall Creek Massacre. 28. Unarmed Aboriginal men, women, and children were tied up and slaughtered by white settlers with swords and guns. 1834. Battle of Pinjarra, Western Australia. An attack on the Binjara people left dozens dead, most of them women and children. Gippsland, Victoria. 1840s. The Gunai-Kurnai people were hunted in organized raids. By the 1850s, their numbers dropped from 2,000 to just 8. Many of these attacks were never recorded. Some were even celebrated by settlers in newspapers and town halls. We cleared the land, they said. But what they cleared were families, languages, and lineages. The silent deaths. Not all the killing came by gun. Disease, brought by European settlers, swept through Aboriginal communities like wildfire. Smallpox, measles, influenza, with no immunity. Entire tribes were wiped out in weeks. And then came the stolen generations, the children taken from the late 1800s to the 1970s. British and Australian authorities began forcibly removing Aboriginal children from their families. These children were renamed, re-educated in white institutions, forbidden to speak their native languages, raised to believe their culture was inferior. Some were placed in white foster homes, others in church-run missions, where abuse was common. It's estimated that up to 1 in 3 Aboriginal children were taken during this era. They didn't just steal children, an elder once said. They stole futures, a dying culture, a resilient spirit. By the early 20th century, the Aboriginal population had collapsed from over 750,000 before colonization to just 93,000 by the 1920s. Entire languages vanished, sacred sites desecrated, ceremonies banned, and yet they endured. Elders whispered stories into the ears of children. Dances continued in secret. Languages were kept alive through memory alone.
A call for recognition. In recent decades, Australia has slowly begun to face its past. National Sorry Day is now observed. Some massacre sites are marked with memorials. Survivors of the stolen generations have shared their stories with the world, but there is still no formal treaty, no full reparations, and many Australians remain unaware of the true scale of the colonial violence. They tried to wipe them from the map, but the land still speaks their names, and the wind still carries their songs. They didn't kill with guns or swords. They killed with silence, while ships sailed out heavy with grain, and the Irish lay dying in their fields. In the mid-1800s, Ireland, already weakened by centuries of British rule, entered the darkest chapter of its history. It wasn't war, it wasn't plague, it was famine, man-made, deliberate, and cold. From 1845 to 1852, over 1 million Irish men, women, and children died. Another 1 million were forced to flee their homeland, and while their bellies were empty, their country remained full of food. Locked away, shipped out under armed guard, the blight and the lie. The potato blight arrived in 1845, destroying the only crop the Irish poor depended on. Potatoes weren't just food, they were survival. But while the fields rotted, British landlords and colonial officials watched with detachment, because Ireland was not free. It was part of the British Empire, and under that rule, profit came before people, food out, corpses in. Even at the height of the famine, cattle, grain, oats and butter were exported daily from Ireland to England. Armed British soldiers escorted food shipments out of starving towns. Markets remained open for the rich, and those who couldn't pay starved. Ireland was dying, one witness wrote, but the docks were never empty. Families begged for crumbs, while ships full of wheat left the harbors. The hungry watched their own harvests sail away, headed for dinner tables in London. The workhouses and evictions, for those who couldn't afford food or rent. The British offered another fate. The workhouse, these were not shelters, they were prisons of poverty. Inside, families were split apart, children forced to labor, food scarce, disease rampant, punishment swift. Tens of thousands died inside those stone walls. Others didn't even make it that far. British landlords, eager to clear their lands, evicted starving tenants by the thousands. Entire villages were burned or bulldozed. Families were left to die in ditches, cold, barefoot and forgotten. Coffin ships and exile. Those with enough strength and a few coins fled the country, aboard coffin ships. These overcrowded vessels were packed beyond capacity, filthy, disease-ridden, lacking food and fresh water. Many never survived the journey. They died at sea, their bodies dumped overboard, nameless and unmourned. Those who reached America or Canada arrived with trauma etched into their bones. We left with nothing, one emigrant wrote, not even the names of those we lost. British apathy, and worse, historians have long debated the role of the British government during the famine. But one thing is clear, they had the power to stop it, and they didn't. Instead, they ended relief programs, shut down soup kitchens, and adopted a laissez-faire policy. Let the free market decide who lives and who dies. Even Queen Victoria, known as the Famine Queen, sent only a token donation, less than many private citizens. Prime Minister Lord John Russell declared, "The judgment of God sent the calamity," as if divine punishment, not government policy, was to blame. A nation forever changed by 1852. 1 in 8 Irish people were dead. Entire towns vanished. The Irish language neared extinction, and the Irish soul, once rich with myth, music and pride, was left in mourning. The famine wasn't just a tragedy. To many, it was a genocide by neglect. The echoes remain today. Ireland remembers the famine with monuments, museums, and stories passed down through generations. But the pain still lingers, in the lost surnames, in the silence of graves, in the millions of Irish descended from survivors, scattered across the globe. The British didn't pull the trigger, but they held the grain, closed the gates, and turned their backs. As Ireland wept, they came with guns to a garden of peace, and when the bullets stopped, the silence screamed louder than ever before. In the heart of Punjab, in the city of Amritsar, lies a quiet garden, called Jallianwala Bagh. But in 1919, that garden became a grave, not for soldiers, not for rebels, but for men, women and children, gathered in peace, silenced by empire. The Amritsar massacre is more than just a dark chapter in British colonial rule over India. It is a symbol of absolute power, unchallenged cruelty, and unapologetic slaughter. The road to Amritsar. World War I had just ended. India had sent over 1 million soldiers to fight for the British crown. In return, the Indian people hoped for respect, reform, and a path towards self-rule. But instead, the British gave them new laws to suppress dissent, censorship, mass arrests, and the Rowlatt Act, which allowed imprisonment without trial. India felt betrayed, and from that betrayal, a wave of non-violent protest began to rise. April 13th, 1919, the day of betrayal. It was Baisakhi, a sacred Sikh festival. Thousands of people, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, had gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, a walled public garden in Amritsar. Many came to pray, others came to peacefully protest the arrest of 2 local leaders. Most had no idea that public gatherings had been banned under martial law. There were no warnings, no announcements, no mercy. As the crowd sat and listened, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer marched into the garden with 50 riflemen. Without a word he ordered them to open fire. The garden had only one main exit, and Dyer had blocked it. For the next 10 minutes, bullets rained down on the crowd. Over 1,650 rounds were fired. People were trampled in the panic. Parents used their bodies to shield their children. A well inside the garden was filled with bodies of those who jumped in to escape. The cries of the dying, the moans of the wounded, the silence of the shocked, it all bled into the soil, wrote one eyewitness. Official British reports claimed 379 people were killed. Indian records say over 1,000 lost their lives, and more than 1,200 were injured. Most were unarmed civilians. Many were teenagers. Some were just children. When asked later if he felt remorse, General Dyer said, "I thought it my duty to fire. I did not want to disperse the crowd with sticks. I fired, and continued to fire." He was hailed as a hero by many in Britain. He was never punished. A fund was even raised in his honor. Winston Churchill, though condemning the act, still praised British discipline. "There is no excuse," one Indian nationalist wrote. No war was declared. No warning was given. It was not just a massacre. It was an insult to every Indian soul. The massacre changed India forever. The era of trust in British reform was over. The freedom movement radicalized. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, who once supported cooperation with the British, turned to full non-cooperation. It marked the beginning of the end of the British Raj. But for the families who lost loved ones in that garden, there was no justice, no accountability, only pain passed down through generations. Today, Jallianwala Bagh stands as a memorial. Bullet holes still pierce the walls. The well remains, filled with memory, and the silence still echoes, louder than any anthem. It was not a battle. It was not a war. It was a garden, and the only crime committed there was being free in their hearts. History doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers from graves never marked, from languages never spoken again, from the silence of those who survive. Across continents and centuries, the European colonial empires, draped in flags, crosses and crowns, left behind more than just monuments and maps. They left broken nations, stolen futures, and millions of unnamed dead. From the rubber forests of the Congo to the cattle fields of Australia, from the starved streets of Bengal to the mass graves of Algeria, one truth remains. Colonialism was not a civilizing mission. It was a machine powered by profit and lubricated with blood. Every empire claimed it came to build railroads, schools, trade. But what it built more than anything else was chains in Congo, camps in South Africa, fires in Kenya, gallows in Haiti, silence in Ireland, massacres in India. The so-called Golden Age of Empire was for the colonized, an age of whips, bullets, and funerals. Colonial violence wasn't always loud. It was often administrative, systemic, cold. Famines were called natural. Resistance was called terrorism. Cultural erasure was labeled education. Genocide was hidden in footnotes. They built museums with looted artifacts, universities with looted wealth, and cities with looted labor. And when it ended, they walked away, without repair, without repentance, without looking back. The Congo still weeps for its 10 million lost. The bones of the hero still lie beneath Namibian sands. The echo of bullets still lingers in Jallianwala Bagh, and Australia's red earth
still carries the silence of stolen children. Empires fell, but the scars remain, on bodies, on borders, in poverty, in displacement, in trauma that travels through bloodlines. We are told not to dwell on the past, we are told to move on. But how do you move on, when the wound is still open? The legacy of colonialism is not a debate, it is a burden the modern world still carries, in global inequality, in underdeveloped nations, in refugee crises, in color lines that divide, in names that were changed, in stories that were never told. And so we remember, not to shame, not to hate, but to acknowledge, because only through truth can healing begin. They came with flags and promises, but they left with gold, and left behind ghosts, and those ghosts are still speaking. Let us listen, let us learn, and let us never again allow the world to be carved up by greed and power, while the innocent are made to bleed in silence.